It all began on an unusually quiet afternoon in the countryside. The sun poured golden light across the rice fields, the wind whispered softly through the bamboo groves, and life seemed to move at its own slow, familiar pace. Lan, a young woman of the village, sat on the wooden veranda of her small home, absent-mindedly flipping through the pages of an old notebook where she often sketched engines and mechanical parts. Unlike most girls her age, Lan carried within her a deep fascination for old machines, rusty motorcycles, abandoned trucks, even broken farm equipment. Where others saw junk, she saw stories waiting to be told and a challenge calling out to her curious hands. That was when her phone buzzed. It was a message from one of the oldest men in her village, a man people respectfully called Uncle Hai. He was quiet, kind, and carried with him an aura of wisdom shaped by decades of hardship. The message was short, almost hesitant, as though written with trembling fingers. Child, I have an old vehicle that has been broken for many years. It once belonged to me, but it slid into my fish pond and has remained there ever since. I am too old now to do anything with it. Would you like to come and see it? Lan blinked, reading the words twice. An old vehicle? In a fish pond? Her heart began to pound in her chest. For most people, that message might have meant nothing more than junk hidden underwater. But to Lan, whose veins carried a strange love for machines, the thought was electrifying. She quickly typed back a reply. What kind of vehicle is it, Uncle? A few moments later came the answer that froze her in awe. A Toyota Hiace from 1968. Lan gasped. That name echoed like a forgotten melody in her mind. She knew of the Hiace, an iconic van that had carried countless families, goods, and memories across Vietnam in the old days. To hear that one was sitting, half buried and abandoned in the mud of a village pond, felt almost unreal. The very next morning, Lan made her way to Uncle Hai's house. The road was lined with banana trees, and the scent of wet soil hung in the air from a light drizzle the night before. When she arrived, she found the old man sitting on a wooden chair by the pond, his frail figure hunched but his eyes still sharp with memory. He smiled faintly at her approach, then lifted a thin arm and pointed toward the pond. The surface rippled gently, reflecting the sky like glass. There, he said, voice low and heavy with years. It has slept down there for over 10 years. Once, it was my pride. I drove it across provinces, carried my children in it, and delivered goods to the markets. But one rainy season, when the earth around the pond collapsed, it slid in. I had neither the money nor the strength to bring it out. Since then, it has simply rested there. Lan's eyes widened as she stepped closer to the water's edge. Beneath the murky surface, she could faintly see outlines, metal twisted, a roof half buried in silt, vines curling over it as if nature itself wanted to claim it. Her chest tightened. There it was, the skeleton of a once great Toyota Hiace 1968, swallowed by mud and time. Uncle, she whispered, still staring. What would you like me to do if I take it? The old man's eyes glistened, and for a brief moment, she saw a younger spirit flicker within him. I want it to live again, he said firmly. Even if I will never sit behind its wheel again, I want it to breathe once more. That van carried not only goods, it carried my family, my dreams, my laughter, and even my tears. It does not deserve to die down there in silence. Lan felt her throat tighten. She knew the task before her would be almost impossible. 10 years underwater meant the engine was ruined. Every bolt eaten by rust, the frame weakened, the interiors destroyed. This was not just a restoration, it was a resurrection. But as she stood there, with the old man's hope resting upon her, she felt something ignite within her heart. She turned to him, determination written on her face. Uncle, she said clearly, I'll do it. I will take it out, and I will bring it back to life. For a second, silence hung in the air. Then Uncle Hai's face softened into the gentlest smile she had ever seen. His trembling hand reached for hers, pressing it lightly as though passing on a torch. Thank you, child. May the spirit of the old days guide your hands. That night, Lan lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling of her small home. Her mind was racing. She pictured the van as it once must have been. White paint shining in the sun, the steady hum of its engine, the laughter of children bouncing in the back. Then she saw it as it was now, a corpse of steel, swallowed by mud, tangled in weeds. The images clashed in her mind, filling her with both dread and excitement. Most people would call her crazy for even thinking of such a project. Pulling a van out of a pond was already a Herculean task, let alone restoring it. But Lan was not most people. For her, this was not just about fixing metal, it was about honoring memory, respecting history, and proving that nothing, no matter how broken, was truly beyond saving if given enough love and persistence. As the rooster crowed to mark the coming dawn, Lan whispered to herself, "It begins tomorrow." The journey of the forgotten Toyota Hiace 1968 had officially begun. The morning air was cool, heavy with the scent of dew on the rice fields. Lan stood by the pond, her heart thudding in her chest. This was the day she had promised herself and Uncle Hi that she would begin. The forgotten Toyota Hiace 1968 waited beneath the surface like a sleeping beast, and she knew that dragging it out would be the first great test of her resolve. She had prepared as much as her modest resources allowed. A few ropes, chains borrowed from the local blacksmith, a hand-cranked winch, and the help of two neighbors who, out of curiosity and affection for her determination, had agreed to lend their strength. Most villagers thought the effort was madness. That van has been gone for a decade, they said. Why waste your time? The metal will crumble like paper. The engine will be nothing but rust. But Lan had heard similar words all her life, and they never stopped her. As the villagers gathered along the edges of the pond, some to watch, others to mock, Lan tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and waded into the shallows. The water was cold, the mud sucking at her legs as she felt around for solid edges of the buried vehicle. Her hands brushed against rough steel, slimy with algae, and she shivered. There it was, the roof of the Hiace, stubbornly embedded in the silt. "Attach the chain here," she called out to her neighbors, guiding them as they stretched the heavy links across the van's frame. The winch creaked as they locked it in place. Uncle Hi sat silently on his chair, watching from under the shade of a tamarind tree. His wrinkled hands trembled slightly on his walking stick. To him, this was not just a machine. It was his youth, his stories, his family's laughter. With a deep breath, Lan shouted, "Pull!" The winch groaned, the ropes strained, and slowly, reluctantly, the sunken van began to shift. Mud bubbled up in thick clouds, fish darted away in panic, and vines snapped like brittle threads. The villagers gasped as the roof broke the surface, dripping with black mud. Inch by inch, the Hiace emerged, looking less like a van and more like a beast dredged from the underworld. Its body corroded, paint peeled away, windows shattered. But to Lan, it was beautiful. Again, she cried, sweat dripping down her face. The men strained harder, muscles tight as the winch screeched against the weight. The van tilted, groaned. Then with a final wrench, it broke free from the pond's grip, crashing onto the muddy bank. The impact sent a spray of dirty water across the crowd, but nobody moved. They all stared, wide-eyed, at the rusted hulk that had been hidden for 10 long years. Lan's hands shook as she approached it. The smell of wet metal and decay hit her nose, sharp and unpleasant, but her eyes sparkled. She placed her palm gently on the corroded hood, as if greeting a wounded friend. "Welcome back," she whispered. The villagers began murmuring among themselves. Some scoffed, saying the van was nothing but scrap. Others, however, felt a strange stirring in their hearts. Memories of seeing similar Hiaces rolling through dusty roads decades ago, carrying children to school or goods to markets. Uncle Hi's eyes glistened with tears, and he whispered so softly only he could hear, "You're home again." That afternoon, Lan began the painstaking process of cleaning. Buckets of water splashed against the steel, brushes scraped off layers of algae and mud, and clouds of rust flakes fell like red dust. Every stroke revealed more of the van's true form, the iconic boxy silhouette of the 1968 Hiace, battered but still recognizable. The badge, though dulled, still bore the word Toyota, and Lan traced it with her finger, smiling faintly. Inside, it was worse. The seats were nothing but skeletons of frames, the upholstery long devoured by mold. The dashboard had cracked like dry earth, and the steering wheel was brittle in her hands. Rats had long made homes in the glove box, and nests of insects spilled out as she pried it open. The air was foul, filled with the smell of decay. Yet she was undeterred. She hauled every broken seat, every piece of debris, and laid them out under the sun. She scrubbed until her fingers ached, until mud and grease coated her arms, until she looked more like a mechanic than a village girl. As the day turned to dusk, the van stood cleaner, though still scarred. Its true wounds were visible now, holes eaten by rust in the floorboards, a cracked windshield, wheel rims fused with mud. The engine, when she finally pried open the hood, was a disaster of corroded parts. The carburetor was unrecognizable, the pistons seized, the wires chewed away. For a moment, despair clawed at her heart. How could she ever hope to revive something so far gone? But then she remembered Uncle Hiace's words. "I want it to live again." She clenched her fists and nodded firmly to herself. "I promised him. I promised myself. This van will drive again." The next week was dedicated to dismantling. With a set of old wrenches and borrowed tools, Lan began unbolting every piece she could. It was grueling work. Many bolts had fused with rust, requiring her to heat them with a makeshift torch just to turn them. Sometimes, when parts refused to budge, she had to cut through them with a saw. Piece by piece, the van came apart. Doors removed, windows pried loose, the steering column dismantled. She laid everything carefully on tarps in her yard, organizing them into sections, salvageable, damaged but repairable, and hopelessly lost. The villagers passed by daily, some shaking their heads, others offering advice. Children peeked curiously, fascinated by the skeleton of the van spread across her yard like bones of a giant. Uncle Hiace often visited, his cane tapping softly on the ground, watching her work with quiet pride. Lan found herself spending hours cleaning every piece. She soaked bolts in vinegar to dissolve the rust, scrubbed panels with wire brushes, and coated them with protective oil. She bought cheap sandpaper from the market, sanding down the body panels until her arms throbbed. Slowly, through patience and persistence, hints of silver metal began to emerge from beneath the layers of decay. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, Lan sat back, exhausted, her hands blistered and stained. Around her lay the disassembled pieces of the Hiace, still broken, but now free of mud and filth, waiting for the next stage of restoration. She gazed at them, her chest swelling with both pride and fear. This was only the beginning. Ahead lay months, perhaps years, of work building the engine, welding new metal into the frame, sourcing parts for a van long forgotten by time. It would cost her sleepless nights, countless failures, and money she barely had. But when she closed her eyes, she could already hear it, the hum of an engine reborn, the van rolling once more through the countryside roads, carrying with it the memories of the past and the promise of the future. She stood, wiping her sweat-streaked face, and whispered into the night, "Tomorrow, the real work begins." And so it did. After weeks of careful planning and assessment, Lan finally decided it was time to begin the restoration of the old Toyota Hiace. The vehicle had spent decades submerged in the pond, forgotten by time, and its body bore the scars of rust, algae, and the relentless passage of years. But to Lan, this van was not just a relic. It was a story waiting to be told, a memory to be revived. She approached the task with a mixture of excitement and reverence, fully aware that each step would demand patience, skill, and sometimes a bit of luck. The first step was cleaning. Lan donned protective gloves and started scrubbing away the layers of grime and algae from the metal surfaces. Each panel revealed glimpses of the van's original creamy white paint, faded but still beautiful. The interior, soaked and brittle from years in water, required gentle handling. She removed the seats, which had long since lost their cushioning and fabric, and set them aside for restoration. The floor panels, warped and corroded, needed careful measurement to determine whether they could be repaired or had to be replaced entirely. Lan knew that the frame was the heart of the van. If the chassis was compromised, no amount of cosmetic work could bring the vehicle back to life. She spent hours inspecting every weld and joint, tapping and measuring, searching for hidden weaknesses. Some areas were heavily corroded, with metal eaten through by rust. With a small grinder and welding equipment, she cut out the damaged sections and replaced them with new metal, carefully shaping each piece to match the original contours. The process was painstaking, but Lan took pride in ensuring that the van's skeleton would be as strong and authentic as possible. Next came sourcing the parts. This was perhaps the most challenging part of the project. The Toyota Hiace 1968 was a rare model, and many of its components were no longer manufactured. Lan scoured online forums, visited antique car markets, and contacted collectors. She found a few original parts in surprising places. A side mirror tucked away in a dusty garage in the countryside, a vintage headlight in an old parts shop, and even an almost forgotten dashboard instrument in a neighboring town. Each piece she obtained felt like a small victory, a piece of history returned to its rightful place. With the parts gathered, Lan began the meticulous process of reassembling the van. She started with the mechanical systems, the engine, transmission, and suspension. The engine had seized after years underwater, so she carefully dismantled it, cleaning, polishing, and replacing worn components. Pistons, gaskets, and bearings were all inspected and restored or replaced. When she finally reassembled it, she held her breath as she turned the key, praying that the engine would roar back to life. The sputtering that followed was nerve-wracking, but after some adjustments, a steady hum emerged, the sound of a heart beating again after decades of silence. Meanwhile, she worked on the van's body. Rust spots were treated with anti-corrosion chemicals, dents were hammered out with gentle precision, and missing panels were welded into place. Each day, the van's shape became more recognizable. The rounded corners, the distinctive grille, and the large, welcoming windows gradually reappeared, as if the van itself remembered its former glory. Lan painted each repaired section with care, matching the original cream color, blending old and new seamlessly. Inside, Lan reconstructed the interior with equal devotion. Seats were reupholstered, the steering wheel polished, and the dashboard cleaned and restored. She even found a set of period-correct knobs and buttons to replace those lost to time. The smell of old wood and leather returned to the cabin, mingling with the faint scent of fresh paint. It felt like stepping back into the past, a living museum of memories. Lan's neighbors watched with curiosity and admiration as she worked. Some doubted the van could ever be restored. Others offered old tools and advice. But Lan pressed on, driven by a deep sense of purpose. Each challenge, whether a stubborn bolt, a warped panel, or a missing part, was met with determination. And slowly, the van began to resemble the one that had once carried its passengers through village streets, over dusty roads, and along quiet riversides. The restoration took months. Winter turned to spring, and the van, once a sunken relic, now stood gleaming in the sunlight. Lan had poured her soul into the project, and the results were extraordinary. The Toyota Hiace of 1968, though bearing subtle marks of its long journey, was whole again. Its engine purred, its body gleamed, and its interior welcomed visitors with the warmth of careful craftsmanship. Through the process, Lan had not only restored a vehicle, but also revived a story. She imagined the old man who had once owned the van, the journeys it had taken, and the people who had ridden within its walls. Each bolt tightened, each panel painted, and each part replaced was a tribute to a time gone by. And in that sense, the van was more than metal and paint. It was memory, history, and art, resurrected through Lan's unwavering dedication. By the end of the restoration, the Hiace was more than just a car. It was a symbol of perseverance, passion, and love for the past. Lan stepped back, wiping her hands on a rag, and smiled. She had transformed a forgotten relic into a living testament of patience and craftsmanship. The van, once submerged and forsaken, was now ready to roll again, carrying not just passengers but stories, memories, and a piece of history brought back to life. After months of tireless work, the restored Toyota Hiace was finally ready. Lan stood before it one early morning, sunlight glinting off the freshly polished cream-colored body. Her hands lingered on the steering wheel for a moment, feeling the smooth leather under her fingers, the weight of the vehicle beneath her palms, and the pulse of the engine ready to roar. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the first drive after years of meticulous restoration. She turned the key, and the engine purred to life, smooth and steady. The familiar rumble, once lost to time, now filled the quiet village street. It was more than a mechanical success. It was a revival, a celebration of patience, dedication, and love for the past. Carefully, Lan shifted the gear into drive and eased the van forward. The tires crunched over the gravel road, and the vehicle responded perfectly to her touch, as if it had always belonged on these streets. Lan decided to take a slow tour around the village, wanting to feel the Hiace in motion. Villagers peeked from windows, children waved, and a few older neighbors nodded with admiration. Many had doubted the restoration could ever succeed, but now the Hiace glided past, a living testament to Lan's skill and persistence. Every turn of the wheel, every press of the brake reminded her of the countless hours spent repairing, cleaning, and sourcing parts. But the journey was not without surprises. As she drove along a narrow lane, Lan noticed that the van's suspension creaked slightly over a patch of uneven ground. She realized that despite her careful restoration, years of neglect had left subtle weaknesses that needed attention. Pulling over, she inspected the undercarriage and made mental notes for adjustments. Even the best restorations could reveal hidden challenges once the vehicle was in motion. A few minutes later, as she navigated a bend near the pond where the van had once sunk, Lan saw a flash of reflection in the water. She paused, staring at the pond that had held the vehicle for so long. Memories of the old man who owned it, of the quiet village life, and of the van's silent years beneath the water all came rushing back. The van's journey was no longer just mechanical. It was emotional, connecting the past with the present. Encouraged by the smooth handling of the Hiace, Lan drove toward the countryside roads, feeling a sense of freedom and pride. She tested the brakes, the steering, and the engine performance. Everything responded remarkably well, but she remained cautious, aware that some minor tweaks would be needed to achieve perfect condition. The van had survived decades of neglect, but Lan's restoration had given it a second life. Along the way, she encountered unexpected obstacles, a fallen branch here, a pothole there, but each challenge reinforced her confidence. The van proved resilient, sturdy, and surprisingly agile for its age. Lan couldn't help but smile as she thought about how far both she and the vehicle had come. This was no longer just a restoration project. It was a living, breathing testament to perseverance. When she returned to the village, a small crowd had gathered, eager to see the Hiace in motion. Children pressed their faces against fences, neighbors waved, and even the local shopkeeper clapped. Lan parked the van in the sunlight, its cream exterior gleaming proudly. She stepped out, stretching her tired arms, feeling an immense satisfaction. The Hiace was no longer a sunken relic, but a revived treasure, capable of carrying stories, memories, and passengers alike. Later that evening, Lan reflected on the journey. The first drive had been exhilarating, a mixture of joy, nostalgia, and cautious discovery. She knew there were still minor adjustments to be made, small repairs to perfect, and preventive measures to ensure longevity. But the core, the heart and soul of the Hiace, was alive again. It had reclaimed its identity, and Lan had reclaimed her connection to a piece of the past. The experience also taught her patience in ways no book or tutorial could. Every moment of frustration, every challenge overcome, and every successful repair had led to this very drive. The Hiace had become more than a vehicle. It was a bridge between time, connecting her present efforts to the history embedded in its frame. And in that bridge, Lan found not only satisfaction, but also inspiration for future projects, driven by the knowledge that dedication, skill, and love could resurrect what was once lost. As dusk fell, the van rested quietly in the yard, its restored body catching the last golden rays of sunlight. Lan knew that tomorrow would bring more fine-tuning, perhaps some scenic drives, and maybe even an adventure beyond the village. But for tonight, she allowed herself a moment to simply admire the van, a symbol of persistence, memory, and the magic of bringing history back to life. With the sun rising on a crisp morning, Lan decided it was time for the first full test drive of the restored Toyota Hiace. She had double-checked every part, tightened every bolt, and ensured the engine was running smoothly. Today was the culmination of months of hard work, patience, and dedication, a moment to see the van fully alive and on the road again. Lan started the engine, listening to the familiar hum. It was steady, confident, and ready. She adjusted her mirrors, took a deep breath, and slowly drove out of the yard. The Hiace responded beautifully to her touch, gliding over the village streets with the grace of a vehicle many years younger. Birds scattered in the distance, and villagers stopped to wave, some snapping photos with their phones. It was as if the entire village had gathered to witness the resurrection of a long-forgotten treasure. The test drive was both exhilarating and emotional. Lan navigated narrow lanes, crossed small bridges, and drove past the pond where the van had once sunk. Each turn and curve reminded her of the journey, from rusty wreck to a gleaming, functional classic. The engine roared smoothly over slight inclines, the brakes responded perfectly, and the suspension handled bumps with surprising ease. It was more than just a test drive. It was a celebration of persistence, skill, and passion. After completing a scenic route around the village and nearby countryside, Lan parked the Hiace in front of her house. She stepped out, smiling from ear to ear, her hands resting on the polished exterior. She took a moment to reflect, not just on her own efforts, but on everyone who had supported, encouraged, or simply watched the journey unfold. Lan turned to the camera she had set up for documenting the entire restoration process and spoke directly to her viewers. Thank you so much for following this journey with me. Every comment, every message, and every bit of encouragement gave me the motivation to keep going. This Toyota Hiace is no longer just a car. It's a story, a memory, and a piece of history that we've brought back together. I hope you enjoyed watching it come back to life as much as I enjoyed restoring it. Here's to many more journeys and adventures with this classic beauty. She waved, a warm smile on her face, and the video ended with the Hiace gleaming in the morning light, ready to embark on new adventures. The journey of restoration had concluded, but the van's story and the memories it carried would continue. Thanks to Lan's dedication and the support of everyone who had witnessed its revival.